I'm Chris Hurst, and my guest today is the broadcaster and author June Sarpong, who last year became the BBC's first ever Director of Creative Diversity. June, for more than 20 years, you've been a fixture on our TV screens, from MTV to Channel 4's hugely successful T4, from Loose Women to Sky News. You've been a passionate advocate for diversity and change in the media and beyond, and you're the author of 2 books, Diversify and The Power of Women. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for having me. Obviously, it's always good to see you, even on a screen.
Yes,
actually.
Exactly. So I'm joining tonight from my living room in Suffolk. Where are you this evening, June?
Yeah, I'm in my living room in London. So, yeah, here we are.
It's 10 weeks since I've been to London, so it's going to be very strange. I'm going back on Monday, so I'm looking forward to getting back.
And are you going back into the office, or you'll still work from home?
We are opening. We are carefully and tentatively opening the office. So Monday is our first day. So I'm going back in to see how it is. We're not expecting many. We're not expecting many people. Well, we've got a problem if there are, to be honest with you. But we're dipping our toe in the water. We're also joined tonight by a virtual audience, as this podcast is being recorded as an Intelligence Squared Plus online event. Thank you to all of you for joining us. As Farah said, we'd love to hear from you. So let us know in the audience chat where you're joining from. Tonight's event is going to run for an hour. For the first half an hour, I'm going to be in conversation with June. And then in the second half, we're going to be taking your questions. So please do start right now sending them in. Click on the Ask Question button under the video screen. Type your question, press send as many questions as you like, and we'll do our level best to get through as many as we possibly can. So, June, we're going to start to get the ball rolling with our No Bullshit Leadership quick fire round. So here we go. In 3 words, describe your leadership style.
Oh, that's a tough one. 3 words. My leadership style, I would say, I think I am pretty direct. I am laid back, and I would say I'm also enthusiastic and encouraging. So it's 4.
4 words. There you go. And laid back is hyphenated, so we'll. And if you could delete any word from the business jargon dictionary, and we've probably invented a few new ones actually in the past 10 weeks, what would it be?
Not invented here.
Yeah, okay.
Not invented here syndrome is the worst thing one of the worst things that impacts business.
Couldn't agree more. Which leader do you most admire? Could be from any point in history.
What a wonderful question. I think you know who's kind of underrated actually is Phil Knight. I think Phil Knight is as innovative as Steve Jobs ever was, and perhaps he's not as much is not as much of a showman as Steve Jobs was. But in terms of results, for me, it's the same. Yeah,
arguably changed the world. Nike, arguably,
yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. And actually, even though he gets a lot of flack, actually Jeff Bezos. I mean, the patience of that man is unbelievable. I think in terms of results, but obviously there are much more ethical leaders that I admire. But if we're looking at just business results, I think those 2 have done phenomenally well.
And what is the worst decision you've ever made? That broadcastable. Let's.
Worst decision. Oh, I'll tell you one of the worst decisions I've ever made. When I moved to America, I sold my house. I mean, it worked out fine. I mean, I did okay out of it. My God, if I kept it, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have to work again.
Wouldn't be wasting the time on this podcast.
Same. I would be on the beach somewhere.
Yeah, except you wouldn't be on the beach unless you owned the beach right now. I suppose you could be socially isolating on a beach. Okay, well, there we go. The corollary to that, then, what's the best decision you've ever made?
Best decision I've ever made, I think, was actually to move to America when I did. I think I definitely needed that at that point in my life. And then that was 10 years ago or 12 years ago, I think it was. And the best decision was coming back, because, again, it was the right thing to do was to come back. So I think those are the two best decisions.
And final quick-fire question. This is a question I always have great difficulty answering. What's the best advice you've ever been given?
Best advice I've ever been given? It's not personal. I think it's simple as that. You know, so many things we do take personally, and actually if we detached ourselves, it wouldn't impact us in the same way.
Yeah. Great. So that's the pain, or should I say the fun, of quick fire over. So let's get into things in a bit more detail. It feels like we can't really start chatting tonight properly without asking ourselves the question that we ask each other all the time now. And in fact, you asked me as soon as you came on the screen, how's lockdown been for you?
You know, it's so funny, Chris. I think lockdown is an opportunity for us all to reset. You know, we'll never have this kind of time again where the whole world is in global reset mode. And obviously there are some terrible tragedies that have come out of this crisis, but there are also some potential opportunities to do things better and to come back in a completely different way. So for me, I've been doing a lot of thinking about what that is and what that looks like. And then at the same time, you know, taking time to just be a little bit more mindful and appreciative of the things that we just all took for granted. I mean, who knew a trip to the supermarket would be the highlight of your day? I mean, queuing in a trip to the supermarket, the highlight of your day. Yeah.
Who knew being able to find a bag of pasta would be so exciting?
Or some flour. I mean, at least now
no chance of the flour. No chance of the flour.
I mean, at least now we've got over the toilet roll crisis. Yeah. But I mean, like, who knew? So I do think that, I just think of all the plans I had for this year. You know, we were supposed to, the BBC was supposed to be doing a big conference on Thursday just gone. We had holiday plans and so many things that have just, you know, been thrown up in the air. And I suppose what we know is, you know what, we're not in control of anything really, are we?
It helps you put things into sort of some sort of priority perspective as well, doesn't it? How have you found? I mean, you're in it. We'll come and talk about your job at the BBC in a bit more detail in a second. But how, in general terms, how have you found actually working or leading from home?
Well, you know, it's funny because, to be honest with you, most of my life has been spent working from home anyway, if I'm not on set or you know, at a company or whatever. So most of the time, I've always worked from home and then gone to do part of my job somewhere else. So I'm actually very comfortable working from home, and I actually prefer it. I like the idea of this hybrid model where you do a good chunk of your work from home, and actually you only go into the office for the stuff that's necessary, so for your meetings and so on. So I do think going back, when we're allowed to go back, I don't think I'll be going back into the office as much. I think I'll probably do half my time, or maybe three, you know, sort of three kind of quarters of my time and a quarter of the time in the office. Yeah.
Do you think the BBC are good at working from home generally as an organisation?
It's been amazing, and I think this is the case. I'm sure it's the same for Havas. Is, you know, there are systems. We did a panel session last week with a bunch of D&I leaders, and Caroline Casey from the Value for 500 was on there too. And what she was talking about is the fact that, you know, all of the things that we've now just gotten used to overnight, the disabled community have been campaigning on for decades. And so actually what we've shown is that when something is a priority, it can be done. And so, overnight, we got very good at working from home. 97% of the workforce, of the 27,000 workforce, globally are now working from home, and it's working. So,
So I mean, you started to touch on it really, but do you think the world of work is changed forever?
I think so. I think so. I think people with families are going to look at it differently. You know, I think even maybe the world of education, because yes, of course, lots of parents are desperate to get their kids out of the house, but there are also a lot of people that are enjoying this extra time with their children. And actually, perhaps maybe it's not a 5-day school week. Maybe it becomes a 4-day school week. And, like, we don't know. I do think that we're going to be asking big questions. Because even if we do try to go back to our old normal, I think halfway through, we're going to be like, what? Why are we doing this? Proving we can do it another way. So, yeah, I think everything has changed.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean,
we're not going to be able to shake hands. I mean, all of this. Like, there's lots of things that have changed.
I mean, I can't. I often think, I wonder if I'll ever shake hands with anybody again. I mean, it's you know, it's always going to feel weird. That's for sure.
Yeah, and you're always going to be questioning, oh my God, am I going to get a cold out of this? I think we'll do the sort of Japanese kind of, you know.
Which is quite nice.
Which is quite nice, you know, namaste, and also Buddhist, you know, salute the divinity in you and all that.
And so how do you think the pandemic will affect issues of, I mean, your job is around driving diversity, greater diversity within the BBC. How do you think the pandemic will impact issues of diversity in the workplace? I mean, do you think it'll accelerate positive change, or do you think there's a danger it gets sort of pushed down the agenda as companies and organizations sort of struggle to sort of stay alive, kind of thing?
I think there are sort of almost two roads, aren't there? And I think there will be the companies who actually regress, not even go back to what they were doing before, but actually say there's no money for this, we're going to stop. And then there are those that will realize that actually investing in this even more is how we're going to get ourselves out of this mess, because we need the diversity of thinking. We need those diverse voices. And also, particularly if you are a B2C business, and we are going into a depression, a recession, depression, whatever it's going to be, whatever we know we're going into financial difficulty.
Yeah.
If we are going into that, well, then surely you need to appeal to as many people as possible, to engage with as many people as possible who can buy your product, to buy your product. So I do think that it's going to, particularly in your business, I think it's going to matter more. So, and also, actually, if you look at where the growth is going to be, the growth was already happening in emerging markets anyway. And weirdly, this is the one thing that emerging markets have not been as adversely impacted by as the West, which is usually certainly not the case. Now, that could completely change. But as it stands now, if you look at, with the exception of the East Asian countries, but if you look at the Southern Asian countries, if you look at Africa, if you look at the Caribbean, if you look at Latin America, their cases, they're still bad, but it's nowhere near as bad as what it is in the West. And so I wonder what that's also going to mean for the global economy. And so it really does matter how you engage with diverse communities going forward.
And do you think, I mean, you sort of touched on this, but do you think the fact that we've all become an awful lot more used to communicating in different ways, you know, as we are doing now, rather than face-to-face via video, for example, do you think that actually has the possibility of overcoming some of the access issues that some parts of society have had? So, for example, for disabled people, or even people that possibly can't work full-time, or for whom they'd like to work, but the commute is a difficulty, or what have you.
Oh, for sure. And even global workforces. You know, now we've proven your staff does not have to be with you. So for you, your director of whatever could be based in China, and they could do their job just as effectively. So I think it does. It throws all of the old thinking on its head, and it makes us look at things completely different. That we can.
And again, you touched on how different countries have dealt with coronavirus. I mean, there's been some interesting articles in the press about how some countries run by female leaders have been more successful in managing the crisis. So New Zealand, Finland, Germany, Taiwan. Do you think that genuinely is down to the fact that there are female leaders in those countries, and therefore could you draw some conclusions around how females lead?
I don't know about that, but what I do think works for sure is when you have a gender equal team. So, you know, what we should be trying to do is get more women in leadership positions, so that there are more women around the table when the decisions are being made. And so for me, I'm not in favor of sort of replacing male dominance with female dominance. No, I think what we need to get to is a place where you're just allowing people to progress to the best of their ability, regardless of gender. So I don't know about that.
So do you think though? So I agree with you. So we want. I think you talk about everybody in the room. Do you think that the diverse teams reach different or better decisions?
Well, they do. All the data shows they do. It's not even do I think. The data shows that they do. If you look at the McKinsey study on diversity matters in terms of outcomes, and then there's a great study by a professor at MIT called Professor Tom Malone, who looks at collective intelligence, and the better the gender split, the better the ethnicity split, the better the team performs. So, yeah, they do. So really, the way I see this in terms of diversity, it's not just a moral issue, which we know it is. It's an opportunity issue in that we've only scratched the surface of what we're capable of, because we've had just such a small percentage of society haven't been given the opportunity to perform to their full potential. So imagine if we did that for everybody else, what breakthroughs and innovations that would come. So to me, I'm excited.
Absolutely. And I mean, we find ourselves in a period of discontinuous change right now. So if ever there's an opportunity to sort of to break things and refix them in a different order in some shape or form, now surely the best time in our lifetime probably to try and do that. So let's talk a bit about your job. You've got a huge job.
It's big yours.
Well, there's probably more people in the BBC, I suspect, than in Havas. What's so roughly as a headline to get us all started? What's your basic remit? What's your job description? If you like?
Yes, my basic remit is to help the BBC become much more representative in terms of its output, its creative output. So that mainly entails content, radio and education. But since I've been there, what I've said is actually let's look at the whole of our creativity. So everything that comes under us. So our marketing teams, our D&E in terms of our sort of digital teams, and anybody that engages with our audience in some way through sort of content production, we should be looking to make those teams as diverse or as inclusive as possible. And we launched last week the first phase of our strategy, which we're calling Rivers, the 6 streams of inclusion. And that's really all around how you create a framework that all creative teams can use. And actually the way we've done it is we've designed it so the whole creative industry can modify and use it themselves. So we'll happily send you the tools, the toolkit.
Thank you.
Yeah,
great job.
Rivers family.
And so you're not just new to that role; it is a new role. Am I right in saying?
Yeah, it's a new role. So I get to what I do.
Yeah, I was going to say. So presumably you had to an extent design the role yourself a little bit.
Yeah, totally. Which is really exciting. In that,
how do you know where to begin? I mean, it's this huge topic, this huge organisation.
Well, I think really is from experience, Chris, in that, I've been talent most of my life. And so I know firsthand what the BBC is very good at and perhaps what it hasn't been as good at where diverse talent is concerned. But also I understand what creatives are up against. So I'm not in there saying, oh, why haven't you done this? Why haven't you done it? Because I understand, putting together productions and so on, it's complicated. And so therefore, understanding the process and understanding how teams are sourced in the first place means that you can be that much more informed in terms of how you deal with teams to get them to change. So, I think my experience as talent is really what's helped shape the kind of direction that I want to take the department in.
And the BBC have made some pretty big pledges: 50% of on-air roles to go to women by the end of the year, 50% of those roles to go to BAME staff, 8% for disabled, 8% LGBT. Quotas can be, can be controversial. You've said in the past you're very much in favour of setting quotas and setting targets. So a couple of questions in there. One, is the BBC on track to meet those? And two, what do you think? Why do you think they're so important?
Well, I think we're for sure on track with on-screen representation. In fact, we've surpassed some of those figures. And on-screen, Charlotte Moore, who's our director of content, has done a phenomenal job. But behind the camera, certainly not. And so now the work is, how do we replicate the success we've had on screen behind the camera? And actually, if you get it right behind the camera, that influences just how much more authentic what happens in front of the camera is. So, it's really looking at how we engage with the supply chain and how we bring more diverse owned indies into our supply chain. And then also even just crews, even if it's not a diverse owned indie, it's, whatever indie you're working with, ensuring that their production team is diverse and inclusive and that you're actually encouraging them. So one of the other things we're doing is we've partnered with Dr. Stacey Smith from the Annenberg Institution, which is the Inclusive and Inclusion Initiative. So she's the woman who created the Hollywood Inclusion Rider, the one that Frances McDormand mentioned at the Oscars, etc. And so what we're looking to do with her is we're calling it the Belonging Blueprint, which is a template for all our suppliers in terms of how they actually prepare and get their crews ready to be inclusive for when we bring in our own inclusion rider, which is coming later on in the year. So, I think it's really important that this stuff is not just designed and then implemented, but also measured. Because you have to be able to see, is it working? And if it isn't working, what about it isn't working? And how do we tweak that?
Yes. Yes, I understand. Why do you think the BBC? I guess not just the BBC, but that's where you are. So we'll focus on that. Why do you think, sort of in front of you, you've done made faster progress? Let's put it that way, in front of camera rather than behind.
Well, I think it's easier. I think in front of camera is much easier in the sense that we know where the talent is. It's talent tends to be represented by agents, and therefore, if you know whoever's one sort of big BBC presenter that you often use, that agent, and you say we're trying to be more inclusive, there's lots of talent they can suggest. Oh, we've got X who person in our book. Whereas we know that within our industry, it's very much about who you know still, unfortunately. And therefore, it's back to, you and I have discussed this many times about, how to make sure we all have much more inclusive social circles. Therefore, if who you know is just like you, you're not going to know where those diverse suppliers are or who the diverse cameraman is and blah, blah, blah. And so that is why I would say it's much harder also because of the past lack of opportunity that there has been in our industry for diverse talent. A lot of them leave. So retention levels are low. So they come to your industry, because you guys still have problems, but you're further ahead in that regard than we are. And so I think that what happens is that, there isn't the same retention level. People leave and then you don't know where to find them. So you have to make a concerted effort to go and find this talent. Let them know that actually you want them and you need them.
And do you feel that all the responsibility falls on you?
No. And that's what I said when I joined. I said, it's not my change. It's the organization's change, in that people, leaders, line managers, they have to own it themselves. I can suggest things, but it's actually about them to implement it and make that change in their division. So no, I don't see that responsibility on myself at all.
So you feel that the organisation has embraced the challenge, so to speak, even though
no question. Yeah, definitely, no question. They really realise that if they want to survive another 100 years, then they have to reflect the nation, because there was a time where people didn't expect to see themselves, so it was different. Now, not only do people expect to see themselves, but actually the country expects to see them too. If you look at the social attitudes of young people, they're much more progressive and inclusive than their parents or grandparents. And actually, that's the future. That's the audience that you have to appeal to. So,
And again, and the BBC is literally an institution, I think, or in this country. And so it's in a way, it's not just about the BBC. It's about the BBC, all the things you've talked about supply chains and about not the people watching, but the people you're commissioning work from, the way you're hiring people out of universities and people who aren't going to university as well, of course. It has the potential and the opportunity to change society in a way that not many of our organizations do have, I think.
100%, Chris, in terms of the BBC is really the mirror of ourselves, to ourselves. And actually it is also the engine of our creative industry. And not even just in terms of broadcasting, because even if you look at BBC Creative, think how many people out of BBC Creative go into your industry and go into, they start at creative, they hone their craft, and then companies that have us come and poach them. And so, there's so many.
We do our best.
You do your best, exactly. There's so many facets to the organization that feeds through to our creative industry. So it's so important that the BBC exists. And actually, when you're going through a crisis like what we're going through, where perhaps some of the commercial organizations might not survive, it's the BBC that keeps the business going for when there is a boom time again and you do get more competition. So,
I mean, I've never worked at the BBC, but I've at various points. In fact, the BBC are, in full disclosure, the BBC are currently one of our clients. So thank you very much. So thank you to the BBC. But we at various points, various agencies through my career, I've worked with the BBC. I've always been a big advocate of the BBC, and I think that they seem to have had a particular kicking recently. Let's put it that way, for various political reasons. But certainly, in my opinion, they are a really important force for good for the country in lots of ways, but particularly in the way that you're talking about, in terms of their ability to create genuine societal change. That's my little bit of politics from me. So you've been an advocate for, you've been a public figure for many years, an advocate, an agitator for change on the subject of diversity inclusion for a long time. Have you found it difficult, the transition from being, if you like, an agitator and a commentator, then suddenly being the person at least partly responsible for making the changes? Or is it sort of like the job I've always wanted?
It's so funny, because yesterday when we were doing the tech rehearsal for this, I was talking to Farah, and I was saying, actually, when you go in and you're now on the other side, you see things completely differently in terms of how you engage stakeholders and gatekeepers. I think that, often when you're sort of on the campaigning side of things and wanting to be an agent of change, the sort of injustice of it all means that, quite rightly, you're sort of quite angry and maybe a bit agitated. And I think that sometimes we forget it is actually a human being on the other side of the email or the, text, or if you're speaking publicly about someone, it's still a human being. And I think that we need, in order to really get results, I think there needs to be a sort of a next level, which is much more about constructive dialogue and constructive solutions-led conversations, which really are about, okay, well, what can we do? As opposed to just the sort of the usual calling out wrongs, which is right, but actually, well, then let's get to the right. You know what I mean? Like, we know the wrongs, let's get to the right. And how do we do that together? And I think we need much more of that. And I think being on the other side of it, being on the other side of it means that I've become much more mindful of that. So even when I'm no longer in this position, I think just having done it will definitely change how I go about this stuff.
Great. And so before joining the BBC, you wrote a book called Diversify.
Yeah.
What did you want to achieve? I mean, I think the title gives us a clue, but what did you hope to achieve with the book?
Yeah, well, for me, Diversify was really all about how to create, I suppose, a toolkit for change. It's very prescriptive, the book. And I also made a point of making sure that it was data-led, but still, with a lot of qualitative work as well, so that it wasn't just quantitative data, but really with stories, but backed up by the numbers, to sort of reaffirm why I believe that this was something that mattered, and then also to show that there is excitement here, and there's positivity. It doesn't have to be a negative conversation, which is what it tends to be.
Yes.
So yeah.
Your subhead on the cover is "The world is separate enough." So is that what? Is that we've got a lot more in common than divides us? Is that
and actually, I think it's both. I think there's a lot we don't have in common, but great, we can learn from that.
That's okay too. Yeah, exactly.
That's okay too, right?
That makes it more interesting, doesn't it? Isn't that?
Let me learn from someone that I don't know, and let me learn a viewpoint that perhaps I had never considered before, even if I disagree with it. But at least if I understand how that person's got to thinking that way, it gives me a much more informed position to take if my position is against it.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because one of my current bugbears now, and I'm sure, in fact, I'm sure it's a more of a bubble issue than hope. It's more of a bubble issue than a real world issue. But I do worry that we sort of forgotten, or at least forgetting, how to disagree with each other without falling out.
I know, yeah, right. How to agree to disagree. It's fine.
Yeah, exactly. We just don't agree on that. Let's go for a pint. Exactly.
And we talk about your book a bit as well, because actually I think what you did there was really important in just showing that, enough of all the chat and all of the kind of the big sell. Like sometimes there is just a real simple, clear way to create effective leadership.
Well, thank you. That's certainly my intention. I mean, it's about saying, I think I asked you right at the start about what buzzwords do you hate. I think there's an awful lot of bullshit is the title, which is not to say that there aren't things that are very difficult. They are, but the short version is, it's difficult but not complicated, and I think you can apply that to quite a lot of things. I do have to ask you. I gather there's a story about Las Vegas that is the catalyst to you writing.
Yes, very much.
Is it a story that is shareable for the wider public, or is it?
Of course, yeah. So basically, I'll sort of summarize it. So I was filming in America many years ago, and I grew up in a very multicultural area. I started working in entertainment and media at a very young age. And so I was always around difference and people from all walks of life. And it was something that I prided myself on as being very comfortable with. And so I was filming in America a few years ago, and a young guy appeared on set who had sort of, tattoos. And I made up in my head all these ideas about who I thought he was. And also the thing it wasn't so much about meeting somebody like him, period, because I grew up on a council estate. So I was used to people like him in my mind of what I thought I'd made up in my head as to who I thought he was. It was someone like him in that context. So even though I've been a big diversity campaigner and so on, I've gotten so used to the status quo that when it was challenged, even I had to adjust. And that moment really sort of was a light bulb moment for me, because I was able to see this issue from the other side, because I'd always looked at it as being on the receiving end as a Black woman and as a working class woman. So I was able to say, oh my God, that's what happens when you see someone as different to yourself. And it made me want to work out how to create a conversation around this issue so that we actually can move forward, because we all lose out. You know, it might be that kid that has the solution. So how we get out of COVID, we don't know. We've never developed talent like that to find out. And so, yeah, it was a real turning point for me.
So you talk about challenging your isms. I mean, do you think that we all basically have biases? I mean, is that an oversimplification?
Yeah, I think we do, because I think we're raised to have them. You know, you've got to be pretty exceptional not to. Because everything in society is designed for us to have an idea of what a leader looks like, an idea of what acceptable looks like, an idea of what desirable looks like, you know, so much conditioning. So it's a job not to think like that. But if you want to create a new normal, then you have to challenge yourself not to think like that. And also, when you find yourself reverting back to sort of safety mode, which is what a lot of people perhaps may feel inclined to do in times like this, it's again challenging yourself in that moment too.
Yes, I mean, my view on it is I agree with you, and I feel like we do all have biases, and I mean, I'm not a social scientist, but I feel like it's kind of the human condition in a way to have biases. We're sort of tribal animals and all, you know, and all that sort of. But it's how you then process that. I think it's your ability to catch yourself, have an internal dialogue, as you did in your, your ability to be able to look at examples and think, hang on a minute, I've been here before, I've made that, you know, I've made that stupid mistake before. You know, just catch yourself.
Because that's who you want to be.
Yeah, and they're just the different. The thing is, they're just different for all of us. I think, or at least for, you know, I think we have different ones.
Totally.
You talk about every company asking itself, how can you? You know, we touched on it earlier. Is everyone in the room? Are there some? I hesitate to use the word simple, but are there some uncomplicated sort of steps and paths that people can take to help?
Yeah, for sure. I think really, is everyone in the room? You know, if they're not, go get them. And when they're there, ask what they think, and actually ask again and again, because sometimes, you know, so one of the things that we're doing at the BBC actually is we have created, we're really proud of this. Basically, you know, we had these sort of leadership targets, which it didn't look like we were going to hit. And so what we decided to do was that every leadership committee within the organization would have at least 2 diverse advisors on them. And so what we're doing with that is we're not just training the advisors, we're also training the board so that they actually get used to being inclusive of this new intake and allow them to contribute their point of difference. And I think that's the other thing. Are you creating the kind of culture where even if everybody is in the room, everyone is valued equally in the room? That's the other bit. Because sometimes you've got them around the table, but they're not really allowed to say anything. So, we've all been in those rooms. No, we brought you here to listen.
We've all been in those rooms.
You have an opinion. So it's really important to do that.
It's actually a great point, and I'm really not my book on this, but one of the things that I always think from a leadership point of view is I mean, we've been in a room with anybody else for weeks now, have we, any of us? But at the point that we ever do end up back in a room with anybody else, I think a key role for a leader, whether you be, I mean, leaders are people at all sorts of levels. It's not just CEOs. It's anybody that you could look at a meeting. Every meeting should have somebody in charge of that meeting. Should have a good meeting. And I think one of those often one of the differences between a good meeting and a bad meeting is the person running the meeting doing what you just described? Is that person including everybody in the room? Irrespective, it's a sort of a different, it's a link to a different point to the point you're making, but I think it's a very important one. If you don't feel that somebody should contribute, kind of don't invite them to the meeting. I mean, if you're going to bring people into the meeting,
I agree.
Sure they're contributing. And that's why.
Sorry, please.
Sorry. Well, I was going to say that's why we're so cynical about meetings, because we pack them full of rooms full of people, and two people talk to each other, and somebody writes notes if you're lucky, and that's it.
Back to that point, even the simple thing as asking the receptionist or the security guard, because don't forget they engage with everybody that comes into your building. There is an understanding they have of your company that even perhaps the CEO will never have, just because of that interface. And I think that even just that, each morning, whoever it is, what do you think? We're doing this. What's your opinion? And I think it's really important to be open to the fact that great ideas might not come in the packages you expect them to come in.
I think that's, I completely agree with that point. I mean, there's the sort of, the classic example is, if you want to understand how a business is doing, let's take a retailer, for example. If you want to understand the big challenges that retailer has, go and ask the person that works at the checkout. And they'll be able to, or if you want to understand in a factory, go and ask the person on the production line. It's actually not that difficult to understand to get insight into the challenges that organizations face. I completely agree with that. Completely agree with that. So FARA has, through the miracle of technology, sent an instant message to say, in capital letters, let's go to questions now. So we're going to audience questions now. So it's in the blue box. I don't know if you can see the blue box presenter chat at the bottom.
I can see audience chat. I can see audience chat. Presenter chat.
I can see presenter chat. So I'll read them. I'll read them out. Everybody can tell we've rehearsed this perfectly. So question one. It's a topical one. Tisania Padolfi. What is your opinion of the current salaries gender gap at BBC?
Well, some of them are ongoing legal cases, which obviously I can't comment on. But what I will say is, when the gender pay gap was first made public in 2017, if you look at what's happened, so they were 2 years old, those figures. So the 2017 figures that were made public were actually 2015's salaries. So if you look at what happened in terms of last year and the difference that happened there, there's been a real reduction. And actually, the BBC now has the best gender pay gap in broadcasting, because a concerted effort was made by Tony Hall and his leadership, this was before I started, to try and address it. And to me, some of the progress that's been made with closing the gender pay gap is an example of what we could do in relation to some of the other underrepresented groups. And I don't just mean that in terms of, I don't mean that necessarily in terms of salary, but I'm also looking at progression rates and so on. That actually when you take a focused lens and really decide you have to tackle something, you can make your way quite quickly. And I think actually the gender pay gap is an example of that.
I mean, we now, any company above, I think it's 250 people, I think is the cutoff, has to publish their gender pay gap, which I think is a great thing. But I remember when we first sort of sat down and organised ours, and there's about sort of 10 of us looking at these numbers, and we had to sort of all go on a crash course of statistics. I mean, I know that sounds ridiculous, but actually, the ability of everybody to really understand the data and then it's a great example, as you say, of getting data, understanding the things data can tell you and drawing the right conclusions from that. And the more granular you can get, the more able you are to fix the problem, if you see what I mean.
100%. It's so true. And also the other thing is sometimes there's the general misconception that the gender pay gap is equal pay, and it's not. The issue is about leadership, actually, is that there tends to be more men in more senior positions, and those roles are paid more. It's not like for like. And I think that there is a lot of confusion in the public around the two. But even so, regardless, I think that if you look at some of the progress that's been made, it's definitely moving in the right direction. And I think what we now need to look at is how do we make similar progress with some of the other represented groups.
Yes. I think that misunderstanding, I think, is a really important point, because it's not about being semantic or pedantic. Unless you really understand where the problem is, you can't fix the problem. And if you're looking in the wrong place, you're not going to fix it. And it's amazing how often you can read in mainstream press, in proper journalists, still get it wrong. You're looking in the wrong place. That's
two very different things.
Okay, so I said try and get
problematic. They're both equally problematic, but they are different things.
They are different, exactly, and both equally important, but they're different things. So I said we try and get through lots of questions, and we're both waffling on. So how do you handle people who are resistant to your message, and how do you get them on board?
I'll tell you how. I don't bother with them. I'm like, life is hard enough. Let's go where people want to do it. Let's go with where there's a willingness. Let's show it works. And in proving that it works, then you find that the resistant ones come on later. But often I think we start trying to change resistant people. That's too much hard work. And actually, you've wasted all this energy and all this progress that could have been made working with people who want to do it. So that's how I handle people who are.
Yes, I think that's a great piece of life advice. That is to all of us. Yeah. And the risk, I mean, I'm not trying to put you in a difficult position with this question, but by and large, do you find there are a lot of resistant people, or by and large everybody wants to create change?
Well, it's funny because I was expecting much more resistance. As an outsider, I had I've never actually worked inside the BBC. I was always a freelancer. And so as an outsider, I had lots of views about what I thought the BBC was. And I have to say I've been pleasantly surprised. I don't think it's a resistance to change. I think it's not knowing how to change. There's a difference. So I'm hopeful.
Do you think, again, this isn't about individuals, but just on a sort of a corporate level, do you think that some people are threatened by it?
I think there is definitely an old guard that is threatened by it, in that they've done, and I'm not talking specifically to the BBC.
No, my question isn't a BBC specific one. No, not really.
I think there's a strata of society that have done very well under this sort of somewhat unequal system that we have, and do believe that there is a sort of an order to protect and maintain. But the thing is, that's no longer sustainable. There was a time where perhaps you could get away with that, but I think that there are just too many people who know different and want different. And actually, we've never tried it the fair way. We've never tried it the truly inclusive way. We've seen all the problems from the exclusive way. So actually, let's try it the other way and see what happens. Exactly.
Imagine, as you said earlier, imagine the potential that we can unlock from all the parts of society. So question from Patricia Hamzi. What is the BBC doing to support BAME freelancers and indie companies? Informal studies show they have been disproportionately affected by COVID. Is that your experience?
Well, there are a couple of things. So we partnered with the TV Collective, and some other broadcasters, including Channel 4, ITV, and also the BFI. And what we're doing is they are putting on a series throughout the whole COVID crisis to support BAME, in particular, BAME creatives. And so we were really happy to be able to support that, because the way we see it is, these are the creators and the companies that we want to be working with once productions are back up and running, and once, we're back to our regular commissioning process. So if we're able to help them stay afloat during this time, then of course, that's something that we really want to do. In terms of keeping BAME creatives safe health-wise, that's not my area. That's a BBC workplace. But in terms of what we're doing for creatives, just what I...
Okay, great. I'm going to try and get two more in, because Farah is pushing us on. Although I love this one. From Ranjini, actually the thing just changed because she typed something. Yeah, from Ranjini Prakash. Would you say that most leaders have a narcissistic trait?
You tell me, Chris.
Definitely not.